I would now like to welcome the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967, Ms. Francesca Albanese. You have the floor.
Chair, Excellencies, distinguished delegates and guests, it is my honor to present my first report.
One moment. Please turn on the mic.
Mr. Chair, Excellencies, distinguished delegates and guests, it is my honor to present my first report to the Third Committee of the General Assembly as the newly appointed Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories since 1967. As I speak, the occupied Palestinian territory is experiencing yet another spike in violence, marked, not uncharacteristically, by heavy loss of Palestinian life. The systematic targeting and extrajudicial killing of Palestinians by Israeli forces while settlers destroy properties, attack and terrorize unarmed civilians and their children occurs daily with complete impunity. This is not, as it's too often presented, an intractable conflict between two parties born of irreconcilable rivalry and an incompatible sense of identity. No, this is the result of a reality shaped by profound and protracted injustices, where two people are trapped by an anachronistic settler-colonial enterprise. But the pain and the agency differs dramatically. One is the colonizer and the other is the colonized. As affirmed by my predecessor in 2017 and by the Commission of Inquiry today, the Israeli military occupation, the longest in modern history, is in and of itself unlawful. It has crystallized into an apartheid regime as copiously documented by leading human rights organizations globally and within Israel and Palestine. Despite the mountains of evidence available, I'm disheartened by the international community's tolerance of Israel's persistent violation of the most basic provisions of international law upon which the maintenance of the international rules-based order is premised. For 55 years, Israel has attempted to bury the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination in the occupied Palestinian territory, which, it must be remembered, accounts for only 22% of pre-1948 Palestine. The right of self-determination is the right of all rights enshrined in the UN Charter and universally codified during the 60s. The right, reaffirmed repeatedly in this assembly, empowers a people to determine their political status and pursue economic, social and cultural development independently and free from alien interference. It is a peremptory norm of international law which creates erga omnes obligations for all of you, and derogation from it is not permitted. Instead, since 1967, the reality of Palestinians under occupation is marked by Israel's intentional violation of this right through the negation of the right's four constitutive elements. First, territorial sovereignty, which Israel violates by seizing, annexing, fragmenting the occupied Palestinian territory in Bantustans of shattered landscapes and lives, and transferring its own civilian population into it. Second, sovereignty over natural resources necessary to develop an independent Palestinian economy, which Israel violates by extracting and exploiting Palestinian resources in order to generate profits benefiting third parties, including the settlers. Third, cultural existence of and as a people, which Israel violates by appropriating, erasing, suppressing symbols of Palestinian identity. Fourth, the formation and expression of Palestinian polity, the beating heart of self-determination, which Israel violates by interfering with the formation of political will and repressing any political activity, as epitomized by the draconian persecution of reputable Palestinian human rights organizations. Israel's systemic and willful violation of those core components of the right of self-determination expose the very nature of Israeli occupation, an intentionally acquisitive, segregationist, and repressive regime designed to prevent the realization of the Palestinian people's self-determination, de-Palestinianizing the occupied territory. This is the hallmark of settler colonialism, which is incompatible with international law and the multilateral order that consolidated between the Second World War and now, and especially through the global decolonization movement as of the 50s. Within the framework of the law of self-determination, such an occupation entails an unlawful use of force and can be seen as an act of aggression that cannot be justified by any claims of self-defense. The sacrosanct security of one people can never legitimize the total subjugation of another. Such grave violations trigger consequences under the UN Charter, international human rights, humanitarian and criminal law, and the law of state responsibility. The past 55 years demonstrate that tolerate Israel's continued non-compliance with international legal obligations breeds impunity. This exceptionalism undermines the primacy of international law and tarnishes the image, trustworthiness, and the role of the United Nations. I call for a paradigm shift in the way the Israel-Palestine question is approached based on the realization of the right of self-determination. Of course, I recommend that the government of Israel complies with its international obligation by ceasing to impede Palestinian self-determination. This requires an immediate and unconditional end to the occupation and the interconnected apartheid practices, starting from the withdrawal of its military troops. But I also recommend to the international community to change its overall assessment and deliberations, taking into account the settler-colonial nature of the occupation. Ensure that Israel compliance with the above-mentioned obligations as a precondition for negotiation. And while it happens, effective measures must be taken to protect the Palestinian people. Despite the distressing present, I'm convinced that a way out is possible if only international law was the driving force behind politics rather than the opposite. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. We will now begin the interactive dialogue, and I will call on the delegation of the State of Palestine who will have 7 minutes, and the other countries will have 1.5 minutes per statement.
Chair, my delegation welcomes the new Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967, Ms. Francesca Albanese. Madam Special Rapporteur, we assure you our full support and cooperation with your mandate. We also thank you for the comprehensive briefing and for such an extensive first report focusing on the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, which you perfectly described in your report as the platform right necessary for the realization of many other rights. When the first article of the United Nations Charter reads, the purposes of the United Nations are to develop, and I quote, to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. And the first, end of quote. And the first article of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights read, all peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Then the exercise of the right to self-determination is paramount. For decades, Israel, the occupying power, has violated the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and is clearly intent on continuing to do so. Some consider that there is nothing that can be done beyond calling for negotiations and providing humanitarian assistance. Some say that they will only recognize our state at the conclusion of negotiations, effectively granting Israel a veto right over our statehood and our right to self-determination. Our right to self-determination is non-negotiable, and negotiations were supposed to allow the realization of this right, not perpetually delaying its exercising or attempting to deny it. Madam Special Rapporteur, you characterize the Israeli occupation as settler-colonial, and indeed there are today 700,000 Israeli settlers unlawfully present in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. And Israel is advancing the illegal annexation of our land. This is one of the gravest violations of our right to self-determination. In that context, What are the obligations of states and other international actors? And what is the role of the General Assembly that every year reaffirms the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination? Thank you, Madam Special Rapporteur. And again, we assure you our full support and cooperation. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Cuba, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Permit me to say a few words, making use of my time with regard to what we heard in the previous dialogue. All the lives that have been lost in the conflict before us deserve equal consideration. We heard of one case on the part of Israel. There are not enough chairs in this room to present the examples of all the children that have been killed during the years. We support the cause of the Palestinian people. The human rights of the Palestinian people will continue to be a chimera as long as there is Israeli occupation and the Palestinians cannot have their own state. Policies against Palestine are counter to the UN Charter and the resolutions of this organization, international law, and are a threat to international peace and security. An entire people has been deprived of its fundamental rights. We support a just, broad, and lasting solution to the conflict, guaranteeing the real right of the Palestinian people to build their own state without borders prior to 1967, with its capital in East Jerusalem. We claim for the end of the occupation of Arab territories. Only the end of this policy of settlement and occupation will make it possible to have the conditions for a peace which has to be based on the two-state solution. Thank you. Luxembourg.
Thank you, Madam Special Rapporteur. Luxembourg thanks you for presenting your report. We call upon the Israeli authorities to fully cooperate and allow you to have access to all occupied Palestinian territory. Your report stresses the fact that the protracted occupation of Palestinian territory by the Israeli state since 1967 violates the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination and also violates several international law imperatives. We are deeply concerned by systematic violations of human rights in the Palestinian occupied territories. We're concerned by the increased violence, including violence committed by settlers against the Palestinian people. This needs to be reversed. Settlements, demolitions, confiscations, and forced displacements are illegal under international law, and they imperil the two-state solution. My delegation is concerned by the recent escalating violence and the responsibility for the violation of human rights needs to be established, and justice needs to be done independently and impartially. Madam Special Rapporteur, how can the paradigm shift that you call for in your report allow for ending the violations of international law and human rights in the Palestinian territory, and how can they move forward toward a two-state solution? Thank you.
Thank you. Egypt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. My delegation welcomes Ms. Francesca Albanese and commends her on the report under discussion today. We welcome the cooperation the Special Rapporteur has held with the various mandate holders, previous mandate holders of that mandate, and other relevant mandate holders of the Human Rights Council, as well as the wide consultations held with various stakeholders in order to prepare the report. We take note of the conceptual framework that has been presented in an attempt to dismantle and reconstruct the political and legal approaches that have been used to uphold the cause of the Palestinian people pertaining to the fulfillment of the right to self-determination. And as much we note the alternative approaches that have been elaborated by the Special Rapporteur and take note also of the recommendations contained in the report, my delegation wishes to seek the views of the Special Rapporteur on the implementation aspect of those recommendations in a practical manner. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. The Ambassador of Chile. Thank you. Chile is grateful for the work of the Special Rapporteur. We follow the conclusions of her report, especially on the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. Chile is deeply concerned over the humanitarian crisis suffered by the Palestinian people. We must end violence and economic deprivation affecting Palestine. We reject the blockade of Gaza and its humanitarian consequences, especially for the vulnerable groups. We repudiate illegal acts under international law, such as the confiscation of lands and property, settlements, insecurity for journalists. Chile believes in the two-state solution and in the right of Israel and Palestine to live in peace within secure and internationally recognized boundaries. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Thank you, Chairman. Madam Rapporteur, Venezuela is fully in solidarity with the occupied Palestinian state, including the Gaza Strip, aware as we are of the worsening of the human rights situation of its population. The apartheid that they are subjected to, given the occupation of the occupying power Israel, and the crimes against mankind and war crimes committed. The tone of the major champions of the defense of human rights disappear when we speak of the situation in the state of Palestine, now requesting impartiality based on indifference, given the violations promoted by the occupying power Israel and the existence of real plans to achieve a negotiated and just solution. Venezuela fully supports the position of the non-aligned movement, which calls for full accountability for military aggression by the occupying power Israel, and that the entire international community and the Security Council work toward the resolutions adopted in keeping with the principles and purposes of the UN Charter. The territorial control and blockade against the Palestinian people has no historical precedent and cannot be supported by mankind. Thank you very much. Thank you. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We thank you, Madam Special Rapporteur, for presentation on your report. The question of Palestine still remains a serious concern of many countries of the world, including the Middle East, arousing their indignation. The Israeli expansionist policy persists in the occupied Arab territories, trampling on the democratic freedom and rights of the Palestinian people. Israel's massacre of Palestinians in East Jerusalem and Gaza Strip represents a war crime and a crime against humanity in flagrant violation of the international law. As long as Israel continues illegal territorial dispossession and killing of civilians in defiance of the just demand of the international community, the peace and stability will never be settled in the Middle East, resulting in a vicious cycle of the escalation of tension. Israel must stop all military acts threatening the rights of survival of the Palestinian people and withdraw from the occupied Arab territories without delay. We continue to extend our support and solidarity to Palestinian people in their just cause for restoring their legitimate national rights, including the right to found an independent state with East Jerusalem as its capital by terminating the Israeli occupation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. South Africa.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. Chairman.
others such as the February 2022 Amnesty International report point to the urgent and long-standing need for the international community to finally hold the government of Israel accountable for committing the crime of apartheid as part of its broader system of oppression and domination over Palestinian people. Your report has indicated that further consideration should be given to the similarities between Israel and aspects associated with settler colonies. This is understood in terms of the denial of the right to self-determination, which is a key component of colonialism, along with the dispossession and subjugation of the indigenous population. South Africa acknowledges the merit of this argument and recognizes that the continued colonial occupation is a violation of international law and international human rights law, particularly the right to self-determination. We too remain gravely concerned about the strategic fragmentation of Palestinian territory through the gradual establishment and support of colonial settlement in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. These acts continue to violate international law and question our own role as an international community. If we have failed to uphold Palestine's right to self-determination for 7 decades, how can we hope to address the questions of self-determination and foreign occupation in the globe? We wish to ask, how could we address this inherent inequality in the negotiation?
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. The Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you. We'd like to thank the Special Rapporteur on her report. This is the first time I follow your reports, and I've never thought that I will see actually or lay an eye over a brave report. You might be our new favorite rapporteur. Bara 26 from the report mentions that soon after the creation of the State of Israel, in most of the territory of Mandate Palestine was occupied by massacres and the mass explosion. This is how the occupied authorities started its so-called state. The seed of hatred won't give you apples, it will only give you blood, atrocities, and crimes against humanity. The right of self-determination was the highlight of last century, but the occupied authorities were succeeded in actually preventing this right on all the Palestinians and all the Syrians in the occupied Syrian Golan. We fully support your mandate, and we look forward for extra reports at the same way. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia would like to stress that it is fully convinced with the principles of ending occupation and the establishment of an independent state of Palestine with East Jerusalem as the capital, as well as the return of Palestinians. We stand with the Palestinians and we stress the need for a comprehensive and lasting peace in the Middle East as a strategic option. This was one of the most protracted conflicts in the modern world. The two-state solution is the only solution based on the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which includes the establishment of a Palestinian state on the lines of 1967 with East Jerusalem as a capital, as well as the return of refugees and the ending by Israel of its occupation of all the Arab territories, including the occupied Syrian Golan and Lebanon. We would like to stress that we will continue to provide a humanitarian and relief support to our brothers in Palestine. Last week, we provided support to UNRWA estimated at $27 million. In conclusion, the international community should shoulder its responsibilities to promote and solve the Palestinian cause and to achieve the ambitions of the Palestinians to establish an independent state guaranteed by international instruments. This is a right that has been violated by Israel through its violations of international law. Thank you.
Indonesia, please.
Thank you, Chair. We thank the Special Rapporteur for her report and also appreciate her strong message to not lose sight of urging Israel to end its illegal occupation. Israel has violated every aspect of Palestinian society, from political, economic, and cultural sphere, as well as Palestinian sovereignty over their natural resources. As mentioned in the report, we note the fragmentation of territories to illegal expansion of settlement and seizure of Palestinian-owned structure across the occupied territory, are measures to intentionally segregate Palestinian people and denial of their right to self-determination. For this, we support SR recommendation to the General Assembly to develop a plan to end the Israel settler-colonial occupation and apartheid regime, as well as for the High Commissioner for Human Rights to update and release without delay the database of businesses involved in the settlement. Madam Special Rapporteur, in your report you underline the need to deploy international protective presence to constrain violence in the OPT and protect the Palestinian population. Please elaborate more on how we can make this mechanism effective. Thank you.
Malas.
Malaysia, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Malaysia wishes to thank Madam Special Rapporteur for the report. Your report reaffirms the apartheid practices perpetrated by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, among others through the settler colonialism. After more than 50 years, Israel continues to blatantly disregard international law, expand its illegal settlements, and commit unspeakable atrocities against the Palestinian people, all of which with absolute impunity. Its ongoing blockade and siege against Gaza has exacerbated the dire humanitarian situation there. Yet the self-proclaimed promoters of human rights who trumpet about human rights situation in other countries maintain a deafening silence when it comes to Palestine. Perhaps the so-called custodians of human rights have determined that life of innocent Palestinians are not of same value as those in other areas of conflict. Mr. Chair, Malaysia remains steadfast with our long-standing and principled position for the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. We remain convinced that the cessation of the apartheid practices of Israel, as well as the realization of the sovereign Palestinian state based on the pre-1967 borders, will bring the violation of the rights of the Palestinian people to an end. I thank you.
Qatar.
Thank you. We would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for the efforts made to prepare this report, which reflects the violations of human rights against the brotherly Syrian people, brotherly Palestinian people. We would like to condemn the violations against journalists and human rights activists. And we express concern over the accountability, the lack of accountability and impunity here. We strongly condemn the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, the Al Jazeera reporter, and we urge for conducting an investigation in this. According to the investigations, the numerous investigations concluded that Shireen Abu Akleh was killed by the Israeli occupation. These violations, or these killings, are a blatant violation of the international humanitarian law and a violation of the rights of people to information. In this regard, we renew our call to conduct a full, transparent and investigation in these crimes. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Turkey.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. We thank the Special Rapporteur for her insightful briefing and for her report, which presents an in-depth analysis of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. Mr. Chair, Turkey remains deeply concerned with the lack of progress toward the resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We're also concerned with the lack of interest of the international community to find a just, lasting, and comprehensive solution to this long-standing conflict. The status quo in the occupied Palestinian territory is not sustainable. All unilateral policies in the occupied territories, such as illegal settlements, forced evictions, using disproportionate force against civilians, attempts to erode the status of Jerusalem, to blockading Gaza, have to be abandoned. As highlighted in the report, these actions violate fundamental rights and freedoms of Palestinians, are in complete contradiction with international law, in particular with the relevant UN resolutions. There is no alternative to a two-state solution based on established international parameters. Returning to the political path and accelerating efforts to revitalize the peace process is an urgent necessity. A special responsibility lies with the Quartet members and with the UN as the member of the Quartet. The international community should not wait for a new escalation in the region to address the root causes of the conflict. Turkey remains committed to support all efforts towards finding a comprehensive and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Micronesia.
Mr. Chair, Micronesia aligns with the statement by the Marshall Islands. Micronesia regrets the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry. While we are committed to human rights and aware the unprecedented focus on one country, Israel is sadly becoming an obsession. Comments by a member of the Commission clearly shows bias by this Commission. We must remain objective and impartial in our relentless effort to find lasting peace in the region. The Commission only further contributed to the further inflamed and already polarized situation on the ground. Thank you.
I remind delegations that this is a new debate. The question of the Commission has already been discussed. We're now dealing with the report of the Special Rapporteur on this, another agenda item. I now call on the delegation of the European Union.
Mr. President, I speak on behalf of the European Union and its Member States. Thank you, Special Rapporteur. We took note of your report and are interested to hear about your priorities in the context of increasing violence on the ground. President, the EU position on the Middle East peace process remains unchanged. The EU reiterates its commitment to a just and comprehensive resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and welcomes the commitment to the two-state solution expressed recently by both Israel and Palestine. We call on the parties to take tangible steps towards restoring a political horizon and relaunching the peace process as soon as possible. The EU stands ready to support all efforts to this end. The EU reiterates its strong opposition to Israel's settlement policy and activities, including in and around East Jerusalem and especially in sensitive areas such as E1. Evictions, forced transfers, including in Masafir, demolitions, including of EU-funded projects, and confiscations of homes only escalate an already tense environment and threaten the viability of a two-state solution. Settlements are illegal under international law. The EU will not recognise changes to the 1967 lines unless agreed by the parties. The EU calls on Israel to halt continued settlement expansion, which has reached record highs in the past years, evictions, demolitions and forced transfers as well. It calls on Israel to allow for a tangible improvement of freedom of movement and access for the Palestinians to enable accelerated Palestinian construction as well as social and economic development.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, European Union. Norway.
Chair, we thank the Special Rapporteur for her presentation and report. Palestinians continue to be denied a wide range of human rights. The Israeli government, through the continued occupation, bears the main responsibility. Palestinian duty bearers both in the West Bank and Gaza must also ensure Palestinian life and dignity. Special Rapporteur, since we last met, human rights violations and abuses against the Palestinian population have continued at an alarming pace. We are deeply concerned about the widespread occurrence of forced evictions, house demolitions, and settler violence. The ongoing violence in the West Bank is unacceptable. Civilians must be protected and freedom of movement must be respected. We condemn the recent executions in Gaza. Freedom of speech remains under pressure. Journalists need safe environments. We are concerned about the shrinking space for civil society and human rights defenders. Israel must end the excessive use of administrative detention without formal charge, including against children. The Special Rapporteur should be granted access to Palestine. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, it's an honor for the Republic of Azerbaijan to take the floor on behalf of non-aligned movement. At the outset, we would like to express our appreciation for the briefing and the work of Ms. Francesca Albanese, Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967, to whom we pledge our support in the fulfillment of her mandate. Mr. Chair, during the 18th Summit of Non-Aligned Movement held in October 2019 in Baku, Republic of Azerbaijan, the heads of state and government stressed the importance of the General Assembly's adoption of Resolution 67/19 from November 29, 2012, which accorded to Palestine the status of non-member observer state in the United Nations, reflecting the international community's long-standing principle of support for the inalienable rights of Palestinian people, including to self-determination, and for the two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders. In this regard, the movement condemned Israel's continuing military occupation of the Palestinian territory in breach of international law and UN resolution. They condemned the continuing brutal Israel military campaign against the defenseless Palestinian people, by which the occupying power has continued to commit grave human rights violations and reported war crimes, including by use of excessive indiscriminate force that over the years has killed and injured thousands of Palestinian civilians, including children.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. The Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commenting on this occupation situation, my delegation welcomes the report of Madam Special Rapporteur. The Palestinian nation is experiencing escalating levels of inhuman, intolerable occupation, blockade, aggression, and expansionism under the Israeli regime. Palestinians' basic rights, including the right to life, housing, and employment, are being violated on a daily basis. Furthermore, we are witnessing a new wave of illegal settlements, forced migration, confiscation of property, destruction of farmlands, and arbitrary detentions. The Islamic Republic of Iran believes that ending more than 7 decades of conflicts and disputes in the Middle East and the establishment of a durable peace is only possible by resolving the Palestinian issue by ending the occupation, restoring the right of Palestinian people to self-determination, return of the refugees to their homelands, and establishing a democratic mechanism through which all inhabitants of Palestine, as well as Palestinians driven out of their homeland, could have the possibility to determine their future in a democratic and peaceful fashion. My question for the Special Rapporteur is, what are the most important challenges to fulfilling your mandate, and what can third parties, such as member states or CSOs, do this in this regard? I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Niger.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Madam Special Rapporteur, for presenting your report. Niger attaches very great importance to the situation in Palestine. We reiterate our support to the Palestinian people. However, it is regrettable to note that for several decades, the situation in Palestine has failed to improve. We deplore violence and other international law and international humanitarian law violations. It is important for perpetrators to be held to account for the serious atrocities. My question is as follows. What do you think that after 70 years of conflict, the United Nations can do to regulate the conflict? The efforts have fallen short. We need an impartial diplomatic solution in order to bring about a protracted peace. Thank you.
La Federación.
Thank you. The Russian Federation.
Mr. Chair, we thank Ms. Albanese for presenting her report. We're concerned by the ongoing degradation in the human rights situation in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories. We oppose unilateral actions of Israel, which substantially hamper international efforts to swiftly renew direct Palestinian-Israeli talks and therefore to move toward a sustained peace in the region. Of particular concern are the mass arbitrary detentions of Palestinians, provocational violations of the status of holy sites in Jerusalem, and the increase in illegitimate settler construction amid the ongoing violent expulsion of Palestinians, housing destruction, and expropriations of properties. We are concerned by the low levels of accountability, problems with regard to justice, the curtailing of human rights organizations, and the curtailment of the freedom of the press, even in killing of reporters. We calls for a thorough and impartial investigation of the death of the Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. We trust that a just and long-term settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict can be reached only based on the universally recognized international legal basis and based on the two-state solution. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. China.
Mr. Chairman, China knows the Special Rapporteur's report and finds troubling the continued deterioration of the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. We call on the parties concerned to implement in earnest the GA and HCR resolutions on protecting the Palestinian people's rights. We call on the occupying power to stop expanding the settlements, evicting the Palestinians, and demolishing their homes. We oppose and condemn all indiscriminate attacks and asymmetric use of force against civilians. We call for efforts to combat violent crimes and safeguard the human rights of the local population, in particular vulnerable groups like elderly, women and children. We are deeply concerned by the plight of the Palestinian people in the context of COVID-19 and call for faster humanitarian response and that the blockade on Gaza be fully lifted without delay. China firmly supports the Palestinian people's just cause to restore their lawful national rights. We encourage both sides to relaunch peace talks based on the two-state solution. China will continue its constructive role in the final settlement of the Palestinian issue and will continue to provide COVID-related and humanitarian assistance to Palestine, including donations and in-kind contributions provided through UNGA in the service of the Palestinian people's basic rights. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My delegation would like to align itself with other delegations that welcomed the report of the Special Rapporteur and her efforts to collect information to archive the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. We also align ourselves with the statement of Azerbaijan on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement. Once again, we stand with the Palestinian people. We condemn the grave violations by Israel of the Palestinians' right to self-determination. The current concern with military aggressions must not steer us away from the need to provide international protection to the Palestinian people. Measures should be taken to stop Israeli violations and compel Israel to implement the international law. We also stress that the current violations of international law must not be treated with double standards. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. United Kingdom.
Thank you, Chair. UK thanks the Special Rapporteur for her briefing. We share serious concerns about the deteriorating security situation in the West Bank. All parties must reduce tensions and avoid any destabilising unilateral actions. The high number of Palestinian deaths by Israeli forces this year is extremely worrying and concerning. The UK is fully supportive of Israel's right to self-defence, but where there are accusations of excessive use of force, we advocate swift, transparent investigations. We are also appalled by terrorist attacks against Israeli citizens and the resulting deaths. There can be no justification for such acts of violence. We urge the parties to prioritise progress towards reaching a durable solution for Gaza. Restrictions on movement, access and trade are impacting on the living standards of ordinary Palestinians in Gaza and must be addressed. The situation on the ground demonstrates the urgent need to make progress towards peace. The UK is fully committed to the two-state solution as the best way to bring peace and stability to the region. We will continue to press Israel and the Palestinians strongly on the need to refrain from taking actions that make that peace more difficult. My question for the Special Rapporteur is what confidence-building measures can be advanced to help rebuild trust, improve the lives of Palestinians and lay the foundations for final status negotiations?
Thank you, Richard. Namibia tiene la palabra.
Thank you, Chair. Namibia thanks the Special Rapporteur for the report presented to us. My delegation appreciates the legally grounded focus on the right to self-determination and finds great value in the comprehensive manner in which the report has been prepared, particularly its legal framing of the situation and the enumeration of the implications of continued deprivation of the right to self-determination for the Palestinian people. Namibia further wishes to express our disappointment that Israel continues to be unwilling to engage the UN-established mechanisms. The same state of Israel later accuses the UN mechanisms of being biased in their approaches. We find that this narrative merely impinges on well-intended objectives of making headway in resolving the long-standing conflict. The message of the report is clear. If the status quo is allowed to remain, we aid colonialism, support separate development, and apartheid practices. My delegation continues to actively engage on these issues, and as we are direct beneficiaries of the successful decolonization efforts of the United Nations and its coordinated mechanisms. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Mali.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks to you, Madam Special Rapporteur, for your determination in how you've tackled this issue. We recognize the right to self-determination of all peoples to determine their own fate, and we deplore the serious violations of human rights, including those of children, which merit a great deal of attention and protection. My question is as follows. Following 70 years of conflict, what can the international community do to ensure a true discussion takes place for a genuine solution to this crisis, which today impacts everyone near and far? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Special Rapporteur to comment on the various statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all the delegates who took the floor. Let me start by saying that as a Special Rapporteur, and especially after having been here, including for the previous debate, I feel compelled to stress how impartiality is relevant to the work of human rights mechanisms, myself, the Commission of Inquiry, and others. Impartiality requires acknowledging the fundamental asymmetry in power, resources, and intent between Israel and Palestine's action, and it cannot be invoked while blatantly ignoring the reality. And the horrible reality under our eyes is a consequence of it, and the reality of the international community ignoring it, failing to correct it. This year only, 22 Israelis and 183 Palestinians have been killed, and this sits on the shoulders of the occupying power, who refuses to withdraw its troops and to withdraw its colonial presence from the occupied Palestinian territory, over which, it's worth remembering, it has no sovereignty. The government of Israel regrettably declines requests to meet, to respond to issues of concerns, and to allow us, human rights mechanism, to visit the territory, over which, once again, it has no sovereignty. This violates fundamental obligations of a member state as laid out in the UN Charter. And while it refuses to engage in constructive dialogue and repeatedly violates its obligations, Israel also engages in vilification of human rights mechanisms by attacking them with spurious allegations of anti-Semitism and bias. And I'm very disconcerted by hearing how many in this room didn't take the time to address one substantive issue of the reports of the Commission of Inquiry, while accusing it of bias and anti-Semitism. This is something that pertains to you and to the way you address your work, but I find it very problematic. The Human Rights Council, from which my mandate and the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry originates, which, by the way, is made of the same states who are here, has a mission to advance human rights over and above and notwithstanding politics. The focus of the Human Rights Council on the situation in Israel-Palestine is high. This is a fact, but this is a symptom of the UN failure to resolve a political question marked by profound imbalance and injustice in line with international law. And this is due to the paralysis of the UN Security Council. So let's invert the pyramid and then let's discuss it. And again, instead of engaging on these issues, I see that Israel loudly attempts to divert attention from the reality on the ground. I would like to use the time at my disposal to elaborate on some of the questions that were asked in the interest of time. I think that the report is quite clear on what is to be done. Please abide by the law. The law is crystal clear. This is not a situation where the Special Rapporteur is called upon setting the standards. The law is clear and is closer to power than to justice. And this is the result of a political setting. The other thing, the reality is fully documented. And again, we cannot push this false equivalence between the parties. One is the occupier and the other is the occupied. One is the colonizer and the other is the colonized. So what is needed to provoke this paradigm shift? Call spade a spade. This is a settler-colonial occupation. It amounts to the crime of aggression, and it cannot be defended on the ground of self-defense. An occupier, a colonizer doesn't have the right of self-defense. Now, I criticize in my report the three main approaches that I see the international community using vis-à-vis the question of Israel-Palestine. First, and I hear it here, one is the political approach, which is considering negotiation as the mantra that will materialize by itself, on its own. In order to have negotiations, you need to create the conditions. How you expect, those of you who have undergone colonization, have you been forced to negotiate the conditions of your liberations with your colonizers? No. And so why is this being asked to the Palestinians? And so self-determination should be realized first and as a precondition in order to then see what is the negotiation that is to occur between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Second, a discussion that has taken place in recent years is the engagement to promote prosperity through development and economic growth. But how can growth and how can economic development mean anything to people who are deprived of their fundamental rights, who cannot take their kids to school safely, who cannot access a civil court in 55 years? Please ask the State of Israel, because I cannot do that myself, why it's displacing 1,200 Palestinians from Masafer Yatta, who are seeing, as I speak, their houses bulldozed, in order to have a firing zone? A firing zone. Israel has the right to train its soldiers in its own metropolitan territory, not in the territory over which it doesn't have sovereignty. So you see, it's all these distortions what pushed me to ask you to be honest, not to, to move away from this cognitive dissonance where you see the reality on the ground, but then you cannot stick to what is needed, application of international law. The UN Charter is clear. You don't need other human rights bodies telling you that. There are economic, political, diplomatic measures that are there to be taken. And you can consider doing that as an individual state, a regional state, pending the paralysis of the UN Security Council. And I also have another word of criticism for what I call humanitarianism, the way the question of Palestine over time, and not out of good intentions, I'm sure, has been transformed again from a political situation to resolve in line with international law into a permanent humanitarian crisis to manage. Humanitarian aid might be necessary, but is never a substitute for political solution and will. And so as a human rights lawyer, I can only say, international law is as valid as the will of states to enforce it. And I'm even 2 minutes and 20 seconds, so I have some other questions. So I called for a protective, yes, in the report I called for a protective presence. And it's not my idea, in fact. It has been proposed by the Secretary General in the case of the occupied Palestinian territory for more than 50 years, in fact. And I understand a protective presence must be authorized by the UN Security Council, but I think that there is also diplomacy that allows you to discuss with Israel how to allow a coalition of states to have an intermediary, a buffer between the colonists, the settlers who go around attacking the civilians and terrorizing them, the soldiers and the Palestinians. The challenges I face are many, but nothing compares to what the people on the ground face, primarily the Palestinians, but also the Israelis, because no one can dehumanize another people and not be dehumanized in turn. And no one can deliver the occupation in the violent way it is delivered without being corrupted, him or herself. So I'm profoundly disheartened by the current situation. And concerning accountability, if the killing of Shirin Abu Akleh, who's probably was the most renowned journalist and even an American citizen, and there have been investigations, it's clear who killed her. if even these cannot lead to accountability, do you understand the despair that is leading Palestinians to take the streets these days and to re-embrace armed struggles? And I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thank the Special Rapporteur, Ms. Albanese, and once again I thank members of the Commission for being with us today. I would like to welcome the independent expert on the situation of human rights in Somalia, Ms. Isha Difan, who is joining us via video link. You have the floor,